This is part 3 of our Topolino road trip to Istanbul. We left Yugoslavia and entered Greece. The customs officer was very suspicious of our 2 flat spare tyres, but after a bit of prodding let us through. The officials laughed when they discovered that we were married. This mystified us until we discovered that in Greece a common sequence of questions was, "Are you married?" "Yes." "Where are your children?" "We haven't got any children." "Why not?" "Because if we had some children it would be more difficult to travel." They seemed incapable of understanding this argument. However, we were released, and after changing some money we set out again through golden fields. It was a good road, and we passed through several villages with groups of men sitting outside bars. As it grew dark we found a good place to camp at the side of the road. For the next couple of days we headed down to Athens, trying to avoid the toll roads, and arrived midday Friday the 20th of May. On the way we saw an eclipse of the sun, with lots of people watching it through smoked glass. We put up our tent in the recommended Daphne campsite, which turned out to be very good. In the evening we took a bus into the city centre and mooched around a bit. On the Saturday we started on visiting the sites. The Agora and the Acropolis were paying, but free on Sundays, so we left them for the morrow. In the Central Park there were some orange trees. I stole a couple, but discovered that they were like Seville oranges, very bitter. Even so, we ate them. I had a drink from a tap in the park. Big mistake. Sunday we caught the bus again, and visited the free sites. Unfortunately in the rain, although the sun did come out briefly. I began to feel ill, so we went back to the camp. My temperature rose to 103, probably due to the water in the park being contaminated. For the next couple of days I was quite ill, and Rosalind had to go into the city to change some money by herself. Wednesday I was much better, and we took the bus again to continue with our sightseeing. In a market we bought an interesting old Macedonian jacket. In England we had arranged a transfer of American dollars to pick up at a bank in Athens. However, horror of horrors, we couldn't remember which bank. We sent a letter to our home bank and gave a post-restaurant address for the reply. Because this would take some time, we decided to carry on around Greece and deal with the money on our return. Thursday we went back to the market and sold some of our excess clothes. Ros then, after some haggling, bought a rather good hairy vintage coat which we thought was made of goat skins. In the afternoon we went to a bank to change some of our American Express traveller's checks, but discovered that for some reason the transaction could only be done during mornings. Friday morning I repaired the punctures in the spare wheels, and Ros did some washing. In the afternoon we set out to drive the north coast of the Peloponnese. We were not impressed. There was lots of traffic, and the coast was nowhere near as attractive as we'd expected. In fact, the only thing of note was the deep cut for the Corinth Canal. It was certainly not like the Greek islands. For the next couple of days we followed the coast, and arrived at Kalamata on the morning of Sunday 25th of May. We bought some provisions and should have bought some petrol. Our map showed a road to Sparta, but gave no indication of its state. The further we got from Kalamata the worse it got. Unsurfaced, bad condition, and hills with hairpin after hairpin. Then near Artemisia we got a fuel blockage. The polythene bags that I'd fitted as baffles had been shredded by the fuel cap. There was no way to remove the transparent strands, so the only solution was to turn off the fuel, disconnect the fuel pipe at the carburetor, attach a plastic pipe, turn on the tap and blow the blockage back into the fuel tank. From then on, this was a persistent problem every 40 miles or so. We noticed that we were very low on fuel, so pulled into a roadside cafe to ask where we could top up. This recent photo shows the same establishment. Inside we were taken aback to see a group of about 8 guys, all armed to the teeth, 3 Bren guns and various rifles. The leader of this small army stood up and welcomed us like old friends. He put his arm around my shoulder and we were urged to sit down. Drinks were brought and he told us in the past he'd spent 3 years in Australia. His English was mostly slang, generously sprinkled with swear words at every opportunity. He explained that the purpose of his group was to fight the BB communists who were encamped in the hills. This made sense to the political graffiti that we'd seen on walls and houses. They insisted on demonstrating Greek dances which involved handkerchiefs. They asked us where we were going, but when we said Turkey, they got very agitated and said, "Bad boys there, they'll cut your throats." In one corner of the room there was a couple of policemen who took no interest in the proceedings. In another corner some soldiers who left quickly when they were told the big captain is coming. Eventually the irregular army decided it was time for off. They fetched out some more clips of ammunition and with lots of goodbyes headed out the door, presumably to search for the BB communists. This had not solved our petrol problem, but we were directed to another restaurant where a man siphoned out 2 gallons from a 50-gallon drum. The road became worse and worse, and in one place we had to wait while a bulldozer cleared a way through. One of the crew went off to chat up Roz. The road surface was awful. It was amazing that our repaired spring survived. Lots of hairpin bends and tunnels, but the cliffs were not as high as in the Rogova Gorge. These maps show the route through the Tegatos Mountains. Eventually we came out of the mountains and reached asphalt again and found a good place to camp. In the morning, Monday 30th of May, an old man arrived on a donkey. He tethered some other donkeys and a bull calf near to us. This involved lots of what we took to be swearing in Greek. The donkeys put up a good resistance and brayed at high volume. This done, he came over to us and went through the standard questions. Were we married? Did we have any children? Why not? Etc., etc. After repairing the punctures in our spare wheels, we set off into Sparta. I say punctures, but sometimes they were just lifted patches. We had a walk around the town and bought some provisions, but then we were stopped by a policeman. We were relieved to discover that he simply wanted to swap his watch for my Rolex. When I refused, he offered to buy it or sell me his. The road to Tripoli was all asphalt and without potholes. It was very hot, and at midday the shadows were directly below the trees. We didn't stop in Tripoli, but headed for the coast again. A few miles before Nafplion, the steering became very stiff. The bearings needed greasing, and it was beyond urgent. Luckily, in the distance, I saw a small garage, and we were able to pull in. The proprietor, who was quite old, seemed friendly. I showed him my grease gun, and with gestures pointed out that the Topolino grease nipples didn't fit. He seemed to understand the problem, but couldn't offer a solution. I'd foreseen this compatibility problem before we set out, but didn't have time to make an adapter. However, I had brought some UK grease nipples with me, so that if necessary something might be fixed en route. I drew a sketch of the FIAT nipple and the UK nipple and indicated that I needed to make one fit the other. I then hopefully drew a simple sketch of a lathe. This he understood and led me into an inner recess of the garage. With a grin, he pulled off an oily cover and exposed an old and unloved lathe. It had obviously been many moons since it had done anything useful, but I switched it on and it sprang into life. Surprisingly, we soon found the chuck key and a drill chuck plus its key for the tailstock. There was even a reasonably sharp tool in the tool holder. More gestures established that I was free to proceed. I removed one of the FIAT nipples and fitted it into the chuck. I took a gentle cut across the face to better expose the ball seal. Then I removed the nipple from the lathe and, using a nail and a hammer, tapped out the ball from the other end. I then fitted the nipple back into the lathe. There was no way to cut an internal thread to match the UK nipple, but I brought a selection of drill bits. I selected one with a size about midway between the UK nipple thread outside diameter and its core diameter, and bored the FIAT nipple right through. Finally I machined a short taper lead-in. The next job was to fix the two nipples together. I mixed up some araldite epoxy and smeared the threads before forcing the two together in a vise, taking care to protect the outer face of the UK nipple with a small piece of brass. The araldite instructions said that heating up to 120 degrees centigrade would reduce the curing time to an hour, so I warmed it up over the petrol stove. The used epoxy then seemed hard, so I jacked up the Topolino and fitted the assembly. Gingerly I gave it some strokes of the grease gun. This is the actual item. The joint held, so I transferred the assembly to the other side and greased that. Working the steering from end to end gradually restored free motion. I then applied more grease to each side to finish the job. We thanked the owner profusely, but he wouldn't take any payment and seemed to have enjoyed watching the whole procedure. A place to camp was the next requirement. We found an excellent sandy beach, but a sign said no camping. It started to get dark, so we were relieved to find an acceptable spot just a few miles further on. In the morning there were lots of flies from a nearby swamp. A couple of miles beyond we found an attractive secluded beach, and after setting up camp spent most of the day paddling and building sandcastles. It was the first sunny day for some time. The next day was Wednesday, the 1st of June, but unfortunately cloudy again. We drove on, and after Dikanika the road became unsurfaced and rough again. However, before we reached Nafplion, we found a super place to camp on a small headland. There was plenty of time to cook a good meal. The following day was sunny, with a gentle sea breeze. Some men were tending a nearby field, but came over to talk and brought us a couple of cucumbers. Another guy arrived on a donkey. He could speak reasonable English, since he'd been a waiter in Hydra. The next day we drove on towards Nafplion, keeping to an old rough road very close to the coast. This gave us 2 punctures, but because of our 2 spare wheels we didn't need to repair them immediately. The next day we at last reached Nafplion and parked in the harbour. Our lunch was bread, tomatoes and the cucumbers that we'd been given. Another tyre had gone flat, so I set about repairing all 3. Hordes of children suddenly arrived by coach and swarmed around us, so we got them pumping up tyres. It turned out that they were pupils from various high schools making their end of school year excursions. A young guy turned up with a very fluent Italian-American accent. He was very keen to talk, but we didn't like him, and it was difficult to get rid of him. The weather wasn't very good, so we decided to go to the cinema. The only one open was an outdoor cinema, and of course it started to rain. It wasn't too heavy, so we all persevered with spare chairs on our heads. It was a French film with Greek subtitles, so it was fairly easy to follow. When we got back to the car we were surrounded again by bored teenagers, so we accompanied them to a bar where we chatted and drank vermouth and ate sticky buns. Eventually we were able to drive off and put up our tent in a car park near a rubbish dump. In the morning we drove back into town where we found a more salubrious car park to cook our breakfast. Nafplion was an interesting small town, with a little castle, converted to a hotel of course, just across the water from the harbour. There was another larger castle on a cliff above the town. There was also a very pleasant beach on the opposite side of the town to the harbour, but unfortunately that was fenced off for the use of the Xenia Hotel. We went back to the harbour and I photographed Roz in front of an expensive yacht. For some time I'd been worried about the car oil pressure. On hot days or when the engine was working hard, it was getting a bit low. I decided to improve the cooling. Using my drill and my lady's cutting out scissors, I cut 2 large air scoops in the bonnet. These are the actual tools that I used. I had previously shortened the handle of the drill to get it into a tight spot. To improve matters still further, we decided to paint the bonnet silver, so went into the town and bought some paint and a brush. Soon hordes of children arrived again and surrounded us. It was bedlam. We and the Topolino were a great draw. A poor little professor arrived and tried to control them, but they made mincemeat of him. As soon as one crowd got bored and wandered off, another coach load would arrive. They seemed to be coming from different towns. Eventually the flow subsided, and we decided it was safe to paint the bonnet. However, 4 girls then arrived and wanted to take pictures themselves with the car and us. We tried to warn them about the wet paint, but of course they soon had it all over themselves. They started to ask the standard questions of were we married, had we got any children, etc. We tried to parry this by cutting down the time we'd been married to 6 months, but then they wanted to know if Ros was pregnant. The castle looked interesting, but the entry cost put us off. The indoor cinema was now open, so we watched a Greek film before setting off towards Argos. Just as it was getting dark, we found a place to camp next to a railway line. The next day was Sunday the 5th of June, and we set out to return to Athens. It was an attractive drive, and Ros drove some of the way, but the traffic became heavy and the imprecise steering put her off. However, by 5 p.m. we were back at the Athens Daphne campsite. The following day was Monday the 6th of June. We took the bus into town and were relieved to find a reply from our bank in Post Restaurant. However, we decided to leave retrieving our dollars until the following day. Instead, we did some shopping, and to encourage the weather, bought some sun hats. Later we decided to see the Acropolis by floodlight, but as we got there they switched the lights off. Tuesday the 7th of June was my 25th birthday. However, it was some time before we remembered. We set off for the bank but went to the wrong branch, and by the time we got to the correct branch it was closed. Our next stop was Constitution Square, where we sat on a bench to read an English newspaper. A very polite gentleman asked us if he might sit next to us. It turned out that his name was Leonidas Londo Leondopoulos. I remembered that the historical Leonidas had been a Spartan hero who had defended the pass at Thermopylae against the invading Persians. He explained that he was a retired judge but planned to stand for Parliament. His English was fluent, and apparently he could also speak French and German. He was very proud of his Hellenic ancestry and told us quite a lot about his family and past career. He said that he was a friend of Sir Compton Mackenzie and was mentioned in his book Aegean Memories. Some years back I bought the book and on page 320 found the section. We then went to see his office in the Express newspaper. He had an appointment at 7:30 p.m, but we arranged to meet the following day. On Wednesday we were passing the Acropolis newspaper office when we saw our picture in the window talking to Leonidas. A photo was also in the newspaper, so we bought a copy and were able to get a print. The article referred to an old man relating to interested young people the story of his life. Over the next 4 days we saw Leonidas several times, and at last were able to get our dollars. However, this was not without incident. We had transferred £100 worth, which was equivalent to about $280, but the bank said they were only allowed to issue $200. We pointed out that it was a joint account, so the limit should be $200 each. After a rather heated argument, we won and got the full amount. On Sunday the 12th of June we decided to move on and visited Meteora. It was quite a long way, and seeing a good place to camp pulled off into a field. It was lucky that we did, since almost immediately the road became choked with all sorts of transport on its way to a football match. It was incredibly noisy, with horns blasting out Colonel Bogey and Never on a Sunday, etc. After mending a couple of punctures, we cooked ourselves a rather unpleasant meal based on a tin of fatty corned beef. The next morning we woke to find our tent surrounded by a herd of cows. They were not aggressive, and we were soon on our way again. Meteora was amazing. Monasteries built on top of pillars of rock, somewhere between the 10th and 16th century, and restored many times. Tuesday the 14th of June we set out towards Istanbul, but as we approached Veria the engine started to misfire. On investigation I discovered that the carbon brush in the distributor was practically worn away. The spring was almost touching the rotor arm. We managed to reach Veria and I tried a small garage for a replacement. No luck. But in an electrical shop next door, I was able to buy a rectangular carbon brush for a motor. Using a junior hacksaw and a file, I set about shaping a new distributor brush. This took a fair time, and a small crowd developed. Seeing a foreigner actually making a part for his car was obviously not an everyday occurrence. I reassembled the distributor and started the engine as normal, using the starting handle. This raised a cheer, and we were waved on our way. The job needed doing, but a couple of miles further on the engine started misfiring again. I changed the capacitor, and all seemed well, but again, a couple of miles later, the misfiring started. This time I cleaned and reset the points. Same result, misfiring started again after a couple of miles. Thinking it might be a lean mixture, I dismantled the carburetor, but couldn't find anything wrong. I cleaned it and put it back together again. Just to fool us, this seemed to have done the trick. When we reached Thessalonica, we did a quick drive around the town, but we'd got the bit between our teeth and decided to press on. In general, we didn't like big towns, although we gave capital cities a few days. A few miles later, we found a good place to camp by the sea on the road to Kavala, and just managed to get the tent up before it started to rain. In the morning it was hot sun, and we got on the road by 8 a.m. There were 2 campsites in Kavala, but we decided that one was too expensive, and we didn't like the look of the other, so we pressed on. Eventually we found a promising field and pulled off the road. Unfortunately, we discovered the radiator was leaking. The rough roads had caused metal fatigue, and the securing brackets had broken off. You can see them placed near the bottom in this modern photo. Ours didn't have any brackets at the top. Without the brackets, the radiator had dropped until its bottom was rubbing the cross member. It had worn paper thin until it eventually failed. This was serious, so I decided to come up with a plan the following day. In the morning I disconnected the hoses and lifted the radiator out. There was too much damage just to solder up a hole. I searched through my bits and pieces and found that I had brought a piece of brass sheet about 8 inches by 1 1/4 inches. If I could solder it onto the bottom, it would be a good repair. I cleaned it up with some emery cloth and also cleaned the bottom of the radiator. Among the tools I brought was a very large soldering iron of the type that has to be heated up. Using the petrol stove, I brought it up to temperature and was able to start tinning the surfaces. It took numerous heating up cycles, but eventually I got the radiator and the brass tinned. My grandfather would have been pleased to see me using his tin of fluxite. The next job was to curve the brass to be a good fit to the bottom of the radiator. I then fastened it into place with some wire and tried to sweat the assembly together. Even though the soldering iron was big, it wasn't up to the job. What followed was a very risky procedure of heating the assembly over the petrol stove and supplying more solder to the edges, bit at a time. Too much heat could have wrecked the radiator. It took a long time, but eventually I was satisfied. It had been necessary to hammer the solder into thin strips before feeding it in. I poured some water into the radiator and couldn't find any leaks. The next problem was the broken brackets. There was no safe way that I could repair those, so I decided on a different approach. I cut a branch from a nearby tree and shaped it to fit below the radiator with a smooth flat top. Then I lined the area with rubber cut from the flooring behind the seats to make a sort of nest. Once the radiator was in place, I connected the hoses and filled up the system. It's a pity that we don't have any photos of the radio repair process, but it was very tense at the time, and there was no certainty that I would succeed. However, you can see a photo of a couple of the observers. The whole procedure took most of the day. During this time we collected an audience that consisted of a couple of shepherds, some lorry drivers, and 2 policemen, plus various other odd bods. We returned all our belongings to the Topolino and started the engine. However, our audience wanted a celebration. We were cajoled to follow a 3-wheeled lorry into a village near Xanthi. What seemed like the whole population turned out to see what was going on, and we felt like the Pied Piper. We were taken to a small cafe and plied with drinks, while the events of the day were explained to the new arrivals. The hordes of children were driven off with stones. Eventually, with lots of goodbyes, we were allowed to leave. A few miles later we stopped to mend punctures and of course soon collected another audience. They were eager to help pump up tyres. When they dispersed we found a good place to camp. The next day, Thursday the 16th of June, we pressed on to Alexandroupolis, the last town before the border with Turkey, and did some food shopping. The border itself was very casual and it was easy driving until we stopped for the night. Friday we planned to reach Istanbul. However, the Topolino still had some tricks up its sleeve. Several times we stopped to investigate misfiring. After each investigation it would run smoothly for a bit, but at last we discovered the real fault. There was a crack in the insulation of the high voltage lead from the ignition coil. This was shorting to the bonnet. Each time we investigated it would get moved away before eventually vibrating back to the fault position. A few turns of insulating tape solved the problem. However, not to be outdone, the Topolino developed a new fault. As soon as we stopped, the engine battery started discharging back through the generator. The circuit diagram shows that the automatic cutout must have stuck in the closed position. Possibly the contacts had welded themselves together. Rather than investigate this, we just disconnected the battery as soon as the engine stopped. Travelling on, we passed the recommended BP camp, and then almost before we knew it, the road led us right into the centre of Istanbul, and we pulled up triumphantly close to the Blue Mosque. We should of course have taken a photograph, but we were immediately besieged by black market money changers. It was going to be easy to get a good exchange rate, but we decided to return to the BP camp. It was expensive but really excellent, free hot showers, free cooking facilities, clean toilets and a swimming pool. We set up our tent and cooked a good meal. For the next 4 days we hitchhiked or took a bus into the centre and visited the tourist sites. On Wednesday the 22nd of June we visited the British Consulate to see my friend Julian. I hadn't seen him since I was about 13, but our mothers were friends and had kept in touch, so he was expecting us. As boys we got up to all sorts of atrocious activities. On a visit to one of his relatives we had set the garden on fire and a fire engine had to be called. At school in the 1950s it was easy to get hold of World War II ammunition that boys had secreted from their father's wartime mementos. In a nearby abandoned allotment there was an oak post. We bored holes right through it to fit the various calibers that we had acquired. It was then possible to insert a cartridge and detonate it with a blow from a hammer. The bullet would shoot out and bury itself in a rise about 20 yards away. In his family shed we found his grandfather's World War I Webley service revolver, but luckily we were never able to find any .455 ammunition. We also got into trouble for running wires through a neighbour's garden to set up a telephone system between us. Sensibly, we did not reminisce about our earlier activities. We were invited to stay at Julian and his wife Anne's flat, which was just below Taksim Square overlooking the Bosphorus. This was the first time we'd slept in a bed since leaving Paris. We spent 5 more days exploring Istanbul, but were eager to travel on. Julian said the best thing would be to put the car in customs bond. Otherwise, if the car broke down completely, the Turkish authorities would charge us a huge amount as import duty. Apparently, travel by buses, trains, shared taxis, etc. would be incredibly cheap, as would staying in basic hotels. We would be better off without the car. He assigned a Turkish guy from the consulate to guide me through the procedure. His English was very basic. "Lorries sleep here" was one of his phrases. However, he understood the complicated system and knew when to pass a bribe and how much. We started in a building near the port. I later recognised it as a place where Ricky Tarr tries to phone a warning to Irina in the film version of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. There were lots of paperwork and I was eventually given a receipt. Then they sealed the petrol tank. Every stage took ages and we had to leave the car there overnight. The following day we had to drive to the storage building near what is now the Rami Koch Industrial and Vehicle Museum on the Golden Horn. One of the officials had to accompany us. He was too big to get into the small space behind the seats, so he put the hood down and he sat on the folded hood with his feet on the floor. It was a bit much for his dignity. Then in the middle of the Istanbul traffic we ran out of petrol. In the excitement of reaching Istanbul, I'd forgotten all about the fuel. My assistant went off and eventually returned with some in a can. The official was not too pleased with having to break the seal, and the procedure of having to disconnect the battery as soon as we stopped, plus starting the engine with the starting handle, added to the farcical situation. Finally we got going again and reached the storage sheds. It was an amazing place. Some cars that were parked outside had plants growing over them and must have been there for years. We were shown a place inside, and I said goodbye to our injured Topolino. It was situated on the far bank of the Golden Horn in this photo. This really is the end of our Topolino Grand Tour. The total mileage was 5,654. We carried on without it by bus, train, shared taxi, Land Rover, ship, etc., and visited southern Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Cyprus, Rhodes, and back to Istanbul. Finally returning home by train, 3.5 days without a sleeper. I carried most of my tools home in their ammunition box, traversing numerous country borders without a query. Sadly, the Topolino remained in Istanbul to an unknown fate. Recently I saw one on the internet for £12,000. Although we didn't see another Topolino during our drive, we saw several in Rhodes. The prophets of doom, "you will never get another job," were proved wrong. Having read about the discovery of the structure of DNA, I wrote to Maurice Wilkins, one of the 3 Nobel Prize winners, and asked him if he'd got an electronics section. He wrote back to say no, but perhaps he should have one. I spent the next very interesting 7 years in his molecular biophysics unit, part of King's College London, designing electronics and computerizing experiments. Rosalind got a job in Imperial College, working on thin films, and we were able to find a bedsitter in Hampstead. Professor Wilkins allowed me a couple of months off each summer, and we continued our wanderings in Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. Seeing the interest in the Topolino trip, I've decided to make another video. Initially I thought I would do the continuation beyond Istanbul without the Topolino. It was not without incident. However, since I'm now 83 and don't know how many more of these videos I will be able to do, I've decided to be selective and describe my 96 date to Afghanistan and escape from Quetta in Pakistan. It will take me a couple of weeks to get things together, so keep looking.